Hey, friends. This is part 2 of my podcast that deals with the mystery surrounding the bodies of Union soldiers that may or may not be buried at the Mount Zion Baptist Church Cemetery near Aldie, Virginia. Now, if you listen to part 1 of this series, and I recommend you do, the link is below, you'll remember that I have a friend who was suddenly and unexpectedly impacted by some type of spiritual presence while she was walking near the grave markers of the 12 Union soldiers in the far back of this little cemetery. Part 1 of this podcast asks the questions. Part 2 provides some evidence and some answers, although honestly, it does get weird. So according to the Northern Virginia Park Service, those 12 markers represent what are called cenotaphs, meaning that they were placed there not because their body's there, but to commemorate someone. In this case, I discovered through some research at a local library that those 12 markers were placed there in 1997 in an area that was thought to be empty of any grave markers to commemorate the Union soldiers who were killed during the Battle of July 6, 1864, which took place around the church. Up until that point, there were a lot of Confederate soldiers and markers in that cemetery, including little Confederate flags, but no outward indication of Union soldiers. Someone decided to commemorate the Union soldiers and place them in there. Now, if you go to that cemetery, there are no longer any Confederate flags. That's become kind of a thing no one does anymore, unless you go to the big Confederate cemetery at Mount Hebron Cemetery in Winchester, Virginia, where there are thousands of Confederate graves. However, in this little cemetery at Mount Zion, they have American flags for the 12 Union soldiers, and for the Confederate soldiers buried there, you'll find little CSA markers that are metal and that are put near the graves. Again, if you may recall from part 1, that battle took place between Confederates under the command of Colonel John Singleton Mosby and the Union soldiers commanded by Major William Forbes. The Union force of 150 soldiers was routed by Mosby with his approximately 300 Confederates. Forbes was captured, and the Union Army lost 11 to 13 soldiers killed and more than 70 wounded or captured. Why the number of dead is not more concrete than that, I don't know, but it's usually expressed as between 11 to 13. There are 12 cenotaphs in the back part of the cemetery. Each of them has a name, and that group of soldiers on those cenotaphs represents the 2 cavalry regiments that were part of the command that was sent to hunt down and destroy Mosby, the 12th Massachusetts and the 13th New York Cavalry. Generally, it's accepted by the people that run that cemetery and run the church that there were 11 Union soldiers that were buried in that cemetery, and the 12th was buried somewhere outside on a nearby farm, all of them lost to history. But again, referring back to part 1, my friend was overcome by a feeling of pressure and insistence which she had experienced at some other Civil War sites, but she always fled from those feelings, and she moved away where she was not bothered. Being a troublemaker, I managed to convince her to come back the next day and to endure whatever it was she was feeling. And when she did that, she received messages and images. She heard voices, she saw pictures, which were related to those 12 soldiers. In part 1, I actually provide the recording of that session, and you can hear the pain in her voice as she's trying to understand what they want her to know. That episode closed with me remarking that I was certain that she was not faking anything, and she was definitely under the influence of or being contacted by some type of spiritual energy. The whole session started when she received the message that they wanted to go home. She said they're cold, they want to go home. Now, if you recall, she knew nothing about who they were, why they were there, and then after they said that they wanted to go home, she started to see images of a woman with tables full of food in front of a house. The woman had blonde hair and a yellow dress, children running around the tables and laughing. The woman kept yelling, "Joey, Billy," and then someone named Tick started talking to her, and when she asked him if his name was Patrick, he said yes, he went by Tick. Those 3 names, by the way, match gravestones or cenotaphs that were very close to her where she was sitting. Again, from the first part, you'll remember that those 3 names were Patrick Riordan, William Demarest, and Joseph Lovely. Patrick Riordan was from the 2nd Massachusetts, William Demarest was from the 2nd Massachusetts, although Demarest was one of the California soldiers, and Joseph Lovely was from New York. They also showed her bloody grass, told her they had died in battle at the church there, and then she asked them if they wanted to go back to Massachusetts or New York. She couldn't get an answer from them. I'll explain to you why I think that is in a little bit. But that's the setup. That's what's happening in the first session. So, if all that was not strange enough for you, I showed you a quick glimpse at the end of part 1 there of me using dowsing rods because I was just trying to learn how to use them, and I started to walk that particular area. This part 2 is going to deal with the results of that dowsing session, plus some research that I did at a local library called the Thomas Balch Library, which specializes in Loudoun County. So what are dowsing rods? They can be something as simple as a bent piece of wire. Generally, you hold one in each hand, and then they do something when you point them towards whatever you're looking for. You mention it in your head and you think about it in your head. And they do something like they cross or they point a certain way, and they simply indicate usually yes or no or maybe. Now, they've been around since before the first prophet picked up a piece of charcoal to write the beginning of the Bible, and they're used for everything from finding water to looking for buried treasure. There are plenty of skeptics about this whole process, which is why I say it's weird, but it's what I'm going to show you how I used here. Over the years, there have been a lot of well-known dowsers. There was a gentleman named Henry Gross, who was perhaps the most famous dowser of the 20th century. He famously map dowsed. Now, map dowsing is something I'll talk about in a little bit because I tried it too, but you basically use a pendulum over a map. Yes, I know it's weird. He map dowsed to locate fresh water in Bermuda while he was standing in Kennebunkport, Maine. It was a claim that baffled contemporary observers. Another famous dowser was Louis Metaxas. He passed away in 2005, but he was linked with the CIA on something called Project Stargate. Now, they made a movie about Project Stargate called Men Who Stare at Goats, which starred George Clooney. It was really a comedy, but it was true that this project existed. Anyway, Metaxas' work during the Vietnam War was prominently documented through his collaboration with the Marine Corps, and he apparently worked with other intelligence agencies as well. He became famous for finding Viet Cong tunnels in Vietnam, most famously at a place called Cu Chi, and he proposed that dowsing could be used to locate subterranean voids and booby traps. He was so successful that the Marine Corps had him train other Marines to find mines and spider holes. Anyway, the whole project did not last that long. The Pentagon and the CIA eventually moved away from dowsing. The optics were very difficult. It's difficult for a modern military to justify training soldiers to use magic rods while they're spending billions on high-tech ground-penetrating radar. However, what's interesting is I had the opportunity to talk with Louis Metaxas' daughter. Her name is Jeanette Lucas, and she's well known in her own right for her dowsing proficiency. She is often hired to dowse for buried treasure or missing people. She's also well known for using dowsing and map dowsing to assist in high-profile missing persons cases, most notably the Kaylee Anthony case in Florida, where she claimed to pinpoint the location of the remains. She's continued the treasure dowsing work her father pioneered, often appearing in media and documentaries to discuss the intersection of dowsing, synesthesia, and parapsychology. Her father, Louis, wrote a book called Solutions Through Dowsing, My Military Handbook, and Jeanette is listed in the dedication and acknowledgments of this book. After talking with Jeanette and reading up on dowsing, and then watching more than a handful of YouTube videos about how to do it, I felt that I was sufficiently dangerous enough to practice on my own at the Mount Zion Cemetery. I first tried dowsing with the little rods, purchased magically enough on Amazon, in the enslaved burial area, or what they referred to as the Black Cemetery. To my surprise, as I walked across some of the known graves there, the dowsing rods crossed right as I was over the grave. I kept saying in my head, "Show me where the body is. Show me where the body is." And they crossed. There's also a technique that they teach you about how to use a single dowsing rod over a grave to have it tell you whether or not the body you've alerted on is male or female. I tried it, and I did get different rotation directions in terms of the way the dowsing rod moved, depending upon whether or not it was male or female. It was the opposite of what the YouTube video suggested, but I did get different responses. It wasn't important for my experiments with the Union soldiers, so I did not spend too much time on that aspect. Now, I also did some depression areas in that Black Cemetery area that may have had bodies. The same thing happened. They crossed, but of course, there's no way to verify without any other kind of data that there was actually something there. Honestly, there's a lot of conjecture that dowsing is caused by something called the ideomotor effect, which are unconscious muscle movements. And while dowsing has a long history of colorful characters, modern science typically attributes dowsing or the success of dowsing to the ideomotor effect. Many practitioners have gained fame for their alleged success finding water, minerals, bodies, missing persons, etc. But now modern science thinks this is all loony stuff. Religious people think this is satanic stuff, much like the Ouija board. And of course, I thought it was outrageous enough that I had to try it. When I asked Jeanette about the ideomotor effect, she told me that of course it is the ideomotor effect that moves the dowsing rods of the pendulum. It's not like there's some type of magical force that independently moves the rods of the pendulum, but it is the energy to which you are connected that causes your body to make those movements and to get the response that Spirit wants to provide to you. So yes, you do move it. Yes, it is small muscle movements in your body that you are not controlling. That is how those rods and the pendulum are moved. She thought it was a wonderful thing and that it indicated your connection with Spirit. My plan is to do another whole podcast about the pros and cons of dowsing and the religious involvement and the religious aspects and all that jazz, but for today, I wanted to focus on what the results were from this experiment at Mount Zion. So that was my experience in the Black Cemetery. I hit on things that were obvious, and I also hit on things that there's no way to confirm that there was an actual body there. So let me lay out for you kind of quickly here how I conducted the dowsing efforts in this cemetery. Now, I'm a map guy, so I'm going to share some maps with you to help you get oriented. The first one here is the Mount Zion Cemetery from Google Earth. You can see the basic outline of the rectangle of the cemetery. The church itself is in the lower right of this image. The area that we're concerned about is directly across from the church on the far side of the cemetery in what is the southwest corner. You can clearly see the neatly arranged 12 grave markers or cenotaphs for the Union soldiers. Now in this image, I've just circled that area so you can more clearly see where it is. Here I've zoomed into the cenotaph area, and I've added some arrows to explain things. The back gate where we enter the cemetery from the slave burial area is designated with the yellow arrow. All we were trying to do that day was to pass through the main cemetery to get back to the parking lot where our cars were located. So it was purely by accident that we passed in front of these 12 cenotaphs. Suddenly, the woman I was with was struck with very difficult pressure and pain, disorienting her, and she could barely stand up. I had to help her move about 20 yards away from the cenotaphs to the upper right part of this image, and then those feelings went away. The blue arrow on the left indicates the cenotaphs. The American flag, of course, represents the Union soldiers. The Confederate flags represent where there are Confederate graves, clearly marked all around the Union graves. As I've mentioned previously, this is Virginia, and so most of the men buried in here during the Civil War era were Confederate soldiers. Of heightened interest is the Fieldstones track, marked with the blue arrow on the right. This is an area of jagged stones that have been placed in the ground. They call them fieldstones, and there are a couple pictures here that you can see what they look like. They're not really headstones, but they appear to mark graves. They're arranged in a way that might indicate multiple graves put together. There's about 10 or 15 of them here in this area that have no markings, no indications on them, but seem to mark older graves. Finally, the red X in this image is where I placed the chair when we came back the next day, and the woman sat close to the graves and received the images and messages. If you recall from part 1, she clearly heard the names Joey, Billy, and Tick, which was later explained to be Patrick. In this image, I've shown how close the graves were to where she was sitting for those 3 names. She was right in front of Patrick Riordan, and just to his right is Joey, Joseph Lovely, and right behind the 2 of them was William Demresk, or Billy. Again, the woman that was sitting there had no idea about who was there or why they were there. She never even looked at the gravestones. She didn't want to be anywhere near them from the first time when she felt that pain and pressure. But those are the names that came to her during the session, and this is just to show you how close they were to where she was sitting. What are the odds of that happening by chance? I have no idea. So here's how I conducted the dowsing with the rods in my own clumsy and inexperienced way. I followed this path that you see in this diagram. I simply walked in front of the first row of cenotaphs, then circled back along the back row. During that time, I held my elbows in as tightly as I could by my side. I tried to keep my arms level. I tried to limit any movement of my own that would cause the rods to do something strange, and I just walked along that path. This slide shows where I got hits. Now, a hit was when the rods would close. As I got down to which was the 4th stone in the first row, it turned out to be Patrick Riordan, but I didn't know that. But when I was doing this, I wasn't looking at the names of the stones. I really had no idea whose stone I was crossing in front of, but it hit on Patrick. They stayed closed until I walked past the next stone, and then they opened. I turned around and came back again, following behind the stones. Closed again before Patrick, but right behind the same stone. It stayed closed again until I cleared, walking past William Demresk, and then it opened back up again. So those are the 4 hits I got, or really there were 2 hits that just stayed closed for a little bit period of time, and that's what I marked on this diagram. Now I came back home and I decided to try map dowsing. I could do a whole series of videos about this, so I'm not going to try and explain it, but use a pendulum. Yes, it's crazy. Yes, it's certainly unusual. But after talking with Jeanette about how to do it and watching some other videos, I made the grid. It gave me kind of some instructions about how to go through it, how to prepare mentally, and so on. And I had these tools for the actual map dowsing session. I had the Google Earth map, which you've already seen. I had the grid, which I just showed you. There's also the pendulum, which you can see here. It's a simple pendulum with a crystal on it that has a pointer. And I tightened up the grid so that all I was doing was gridding the actual area of the cenotaphs. Then all you do is work from south to north and west to east, asking the same question every time. Is there a Union soldier buried along this line? And you get yes or no. You can see where I got both yes and no responses, and then where the yes lines intersect is where the actual plot occurred to mark the finding that there was a Union body in that vicinity. The next slide shows a comparison, which I thought was really interesting. Between my on-site dowsing with the rods and my remote map dowsing, I came up with pretty close to the same results. Again, I tried to be as fair about this with myself as possible. When I was doing the remote map dowsing, I was not keeping track of what stone each line went through or anything like that, but just asking the questions, and you can see how the results are remarkably similar. The on-site survey shows the area around Riordan and Demresk as possible burial locations, and the remote map dowsing lines up almost exactly in the same spot. Finally, you can see here I asked some additional map dowsing questions as I was using the pendulum, because you can just ask things and get a yes or no answer, and it can also give an indication that it doesn't know. But I asked, are there any Union soldiers buried in the cemetery? Just kind of a general question. I got yes. Are there Union soldiers buried in the southwest corner near the cenotaphs? Yes. Then I tried to figure out how many might be there. So the way to do this is a bit tedious, but are there more than 2? Yes. More than 3? Yes. More than 4? Yes. 5? Yes. 6? Yes. Finally, when I asked, are there more than 7 Union soldiers buried there, I got a no. Then I asked, are there other Union soldiers buried elsewhere in Mount Zion Cemetery? Because I figured there's only 7 there. Where are the rest of them? The other 4 or 5 to make the number of 12. It told me that yes, there were other Union soldiers buried elsewhere in the same cemetery. So my conclusion, based solely upon map dowsing, was that there are 7 Union soldiers buried in the vicinity of the cenotaphs, with other Union soldiers buried somewhere else in the cemetery. Okay, so now what? I'd used some crazy off-the-wall stuff to survey the cemetery in my own way, and heck, it could have all just been nonsense in my head. The only way to actually verify any of this, in my opinion at the time, would be to use some type of ground-penetrating radar to do a search. So I talked to Jeanette about that, and she said, well, that's all you've got unless you can talk to somebody locally who can go out there for you and do a GPR study. She said I might try going to libraries and seeing if there are people there who sometimes are historians or genealogists, and they may have GPR equipment. So I went to a local specialized research library in Leesburg, Virginia, called the Thomas Balch Library. It focuses on Loudoun County, which includes the Mount Zion Church area. Before I asked the very nice librarian about ground-penetrating radar aficionados, I asked her about Mount Zion, and she led me to a lot of great source material. Believe it or not, I'm not the first person to think about this stuff. Someone already had the same idea back in the late 1990s. So here's an article about Men Seek History Underground, describing an extensive ground-penetrating radar study that was done at Mount Zion in 1999. They surveyed not only the cemetery, but the Black Cemetery next to that. There was an organization that existed for about 10 years called the Mount Zion Church Preservation Association, a nonprofit that raised money to restore the church, which had fallen into serious disrepair after the church became inactive in the early 1980s. But they're the ones who funded the GPR studies. Once I started this research, I found that there's not 1, not 2, but 3 separate studies that deal with the same team coming back in 1999, 2001, and 2003. Each time they came back with more specialized equipment. The first time in 1999, they had ground-penetrating radar and did those surveys. The second time they came back in 2001, they had ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic and magnetic gradiometry surveys, whatever that is. And the third time they came back in 2003, they had the very same sexy equipment, but they surveyed along different axis lines. And they also surveyed some other additional areas outside of the church itself, an area called the Sexton's House, which burned down about 1911. That was interesting, but not applicable to what I was doing. Anyway, this team came back 3 times, all the same guys, with trucks full of equipment, sensors, antennas, and monitoring boxes. They spent a lot of time there. They gridded the whole area and surveyed everything with this very sophisticated equipment. I was excited to read the reports. They're about an inch thick and an egghead's dream, honestly. So here's an example of some of the survey diagrams they came up with. This shows the grid lines where they were moving their survey grids. This is just one of the times. Each survey they did it from a little different perspective, and that led them to learn a little bit more each time they came back. This map shows the areas they identified as where the Civil War Union soldiers might be buried. Now, I should point out here, by the way, that when I first started looking into the history of this cemetery after my friend had the spiritual incident, that the party line, if you will, is that there are no Union soldiers buried there. If you read the historical markers that are placed there by the Northern Virginia Park Service, which now manages that site, the Historical Preservation Group turned it over to the Park Service. So if you read those historical markers, and even if you ask ChatGPT, it will tell you that those cenotaphs are simply there to commemorate the Union soldiers. There are no Union soldier remains there. And one of the reasons for believing this is that after the Civil War, The Union Army had a very extensive remains recovery effort. It was called the Federal Reburial Program. It was carried out by the Army's Quartermaster Department. The mission of those men who recovered bodies from about 1865 to 1871 was to find every Union soldier or the remains of every Union soldier and bring them back for dignified burial, usually at Arlington or other national cemeteries. They scoured all the major battlefields, and over a period of 6 years, they found and reinterred over 300,000 Union soldiers. Confederate soldiers, by the way, were left where they were found, and they had to be collected and reinterred by state and local organizations. But due to the nature of guerrilla warfare in Northern Virginia, many Union soldiers were placed in graves that were unmarked or quickly forgotten, and the Quartermaster Department never located them. And that appears to be the case with the 12 men killed at the Mount Zion Church engagement. There is no record of their reinterment. However, when you read the now official account of what happened to those Union soldiers, you'll see references to a letter from a woman named Eliza Davis. Her farm was located just across the Little River Turnpike, which is now Route 50, from the church. I've been unable to find the full transcript or image of her 1865 letter, but it is often cited, I think incorrectly, as evidence that the soldiers were buried in a mass grave and then later removed. If that were true, and the Union cavalry commander certainly knew the name of each soldier killed, there would be some record. I can find none. And even the pension records of the 12 men, most of them were filed months or years later by their mothers because they were too young to have been married yet. Even those pension records indicate that the remains were lost. I mention all this because there appears to be no question in the minds of the men charged with doing the survey of the cemetery or by the people in charge of the Mount Zion Church Preservation Association. It seems pretty clear that that survey team and the association consistently believed there were Union soldiers buried in the Mount Zion Church Cemetery. They didn't ask the question, are they buried there? They just asked, where are they buried? And as you read the reports, it's clear that one of their goals was to identify likely locations where the Civil War Union soldiers might have been buried and forgotten. But back to the map of the three areas that were identified by the survey team as possible locations for the remains. There were three. The first is what they call the Fieldstone area, which I've already described. It's about 20 yards to the northeast of the cenotaphs, and the cenotaph area is marked on here as number 3. Number 2 is something called the Soldier's Track. During their research, one of the survey team, they found an old drawing on the back of a picture that simply had a rectangle drawn in the cemetery that said soldiers. They initially thought that this was the most likely location, but you'll see that that opinion changed as part of their research. Number 3 is the cenotaph area. They thought it was an empty spot, which is why in 1997 it was chosen to host the 12 cenotaphs. The historical preservation folks must have thought there was nothing there since this was before they commissioned the GPR studies. However, the team was surprised to find at least 8 and as many as possibly 15 unmarked burials in that empty area. They specifically noted that 4 of the burials they found are located in the immediate vicinity of where the cenotaphs are. That strongly suggested that there may be burials there from the Civil War and possibly earlier. So, this slide is a summary of the findings of the ground-penetrating radar team and represents what they found after doing those 3 separate studies over a period of 5 years. Going from the top down, section number 2 is the Soldier's Track, where it's not likely that there were burials there from the Civil War. The next one down is section number 1, the Fieldstones area. They think it's likely there are 5 or 6 graves there. And then further down, section number 3, the cenotaph area, it's likely there are 8 to 15 graves in what was thought to be that empty area. And then finally, on this final slide, I summarized everything with this comparison table. The cemetery areas are on the left column, Fieldstone, Soldier's Track, and Cenotaph. And then you can see the comparison columns, Dowsing and GPR. Honestly, this is like a dream come true to have done the Dowsing experiment without any benefit of knowledge of the ground-penetrating radar studies. It was almost like a perfect storm where I did the dowsing as best I could in my own inexperienced way, but then I got to compare my results against a highly professional and twice repeated professional survey. So in this chart, you can take out the yellow because I didn't survey the Soldier Track, and the GPR team dismissed it anyway. But you can see that in the Fieldstones area, my map dowsing identified 5 Union soldiers possibly buried there. GPR team identified 5 or 6 burials. And in the Cenotaph area, through both the rod on-site dowsing and map dowsing, the remote technique, I came up with about 7 Union soldiers, and they've identified 8 to 15 burials. With that number of burials, by the way, 8 to 15, they think there's more than just the Civil War graves there. They think there were older graves before then that were lost to time. And so in that whole section where those 12 cenotaphs are, they think maybe 8 to 15 burials. So that's it. That kind of compares how amazingly similar the dowsing and GPR results are. I don't know how to explain this, except that maybe there is some type of energy that one can tap into. I don't know how it works or why it works, but it appears to have been amazingly consistent with these professional studies. And of course, skeptics would say it's ridiculous to compare these dowsing and map dowsing results with the results of hundreds of thousands of dollars of highly technical equipment conducted through a scientific survey. That kind of tracks with much the same way that experts would have said it was ridiculous to have a dowser in Vietnam trying to locate Viet Cong tunnels and mines and booby traps when compared to the billions of dollars of highly sophisticated ground radar and search systems they had during the war. Finally, no surprise, the only way to actually confirm this would be to conduct digging and exhume the bodies, identify them, and to actually do what they asked of the woman at their grave site to do, take them home. And I guess that would be the culmination of the whole exercise if someone could sponsor an effort to dig them up, identify them, and return them either to California, Massachusetts, or New York. So let's see if we can take them home. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I know this is whack job stuff. Years ago I would have thought this was completely crazy or satanic or both. But it surprised me that it actually kind of worked. I don't know why. And I'm going to do a podcast in the future. Hopefully you'll stay subscribed and stay tuned in. I'll do a podcast in the future that will bring some map dowsing experts to you via my podcast, and we'll talk more about it and, some of the objections that you'll find in both scientific and, of course, religious circles. Okay? Thanks again. You can find me, as always, at mikenicholas.com, and look forward to talking to you again in the future. Bye-bye.